particularly along Sierra Leone and Liberia's coastline. Gullah, what we call the Gullah. We know that the Yorubas were particularly important because of their metal skills and their ability to build the technologies that were needed for transportation. We know the Mendi, the Mandingo, who they feared greatly, but the Mandingo, the Mendi, and the Wolof were important because of their skills in equestrian breeding and training. We know all of these things because we look at the record. It's right there in the record. Another example of cultural adaptation of Africans in the diaspora was the extended family system in the Americas. I grew up in one of those systems. When I was born, there were 5 generations. I was the 5th generation. And every last one of those people ahead of me had something to say about what I did. Every last one of them, till the day they died, okay? So when I got to Africa and I saw the same thing, I said, oh, okay, this explains it. Because in my family was seen as being odd, as other African-American families. Mine was particularly odd because I had people who didn't want to die. They say, I come from the family where the people, they don't die. They just live on and on and on. So when I saw it in Africa, it was very comfortable to me. But you think about that in terms of a continent and a culture where children are being sold away from their parents, a wife being sold away from her husband, a husband sold away from wife and children. What does this mean psychologically for people who are in the continent experiencing this and people in the diaspora who have no control over their families when in fact they come from heavily family-embedded cultures? They all lived and reconstructed the commonalities of their diverse cultures. Within the microcosm of Africa's enslaved Euro cultures, the common bond of geography, culture, and color, suffering, and hope laid at the foundation of early Pan-Africanism. And this is what we hear with Stuckey. In these times of austere social and political repression, Africa's American offspring were forging this new ethnicity. Professor Stuckey illustrates this in his work, Slave Culture. In writing about Denmark Vesey, who led a very well-organized slave revolt in 1828, Stuckey notes, as a teenager and young adult, when hundreds of thousands of Africans were imported to the West Indies and North America, nearly 40,000 were brought into South Carolina alone between 1800 and 1807. 40,000 Africans. Just think about 40,000 people in a 7-year period being imported into one region. Vesey lived in a Pan-African environment in both locations. He was a slave when Pan-African consciousness was being formed. Stuckey credits Vesey with effecting an essentially Pan-Africanist fusion of relating to Africans from various parts of Africa and the New World. Vesey, we're told, learned several European languages himself, which enabled him to, quote, draw on both sets of experiences, to bring them together to enrich his political vision and inform his religious outlook, which left him ideally suited to lead a movement against slavery. What these conditions in this brief quotation highlight is that nascent Pan-Africanism, or classical Pan-Africanism, was a fusion of continental Africans' common plight, bondage, and worldview, which charged the African-descended population in the Western Hemisphere. It was this synthesis which fostered a budding Pan-Africanism that became at once humanizing and also challenging to racial and continental dislocation. I want to talk about immigration to Africa and the growth of Pan-Africanism. This is sort of the second phase. Between 1850 and 1958, the spectrum of Pan-Africanism's objectives ebbed and flowed along numerous paths. Some African Americans emigrated to Africa, some advocated emigration to other countries in the Western Hemispheres where Africans lived in sizable numbers, and some rejected emigration altogether. In other words, we didn't speak with one voice. Some said, let's go to Africa. Some said, no, let's stay here. Some said, no, let's go to the Caribbean. Some said, let's go to Canada. These earlier challenges to Pan-Africanism reveal the political and social realities of the Western diaspora and is best understood in the context of the expanding cultural definition of kinfolks and the strengthening of family ties. In 1850, Paul Cuffey, a free African-American shipbuilder. How many of you know about Paul Cuffey? All right. Very interesting man, needs more attention, needs more research. Carried from Boston 38 free Africans back to the motherland, and 2 years later, the American Colonization Society was born. Unlike Cuffey's independent and kinship-based emigration, the American Colonization Society was composed mainly of whites with far-flung interest in African reparation, not the least of which was the further entrenchment of slavery. Not all black people in the United States during the era of slavery were enslaved. It was a huge free black population. 750,000 out of 4 million people were free blacks. And some of them had wealth, like Cuffey and other people. What they chose to do, the ones who stayed here made the choice, and I'll skip over that, I'll just tell you. They made the choice to stay here because some of their kin were still in slavery and they didn't want to leave them here. That has been interpreted as that they didn't want to go to Africa because they didn't want to have anything to do with Africa. They didn't want to go back to Africa because they'd have to leave their children or their family or their mothers or their fathers who were still in bondage. It's a very complicated system, this system of slavery. Many of them chose to leave. And some of them, like the group that went with Cuffey, settled and became part of the society. Now, the American Colonization Society, it dawned on them that if these free blacks are going to go to Africa, why don't we help them? Why? Because it was the free blacks, in concert with the Quakers and other anti-colonial movements, who were agitating against slavery. So they figured, you know, the uppity Negro syndrome. So they figured if they get rid of the free blacks, then slavery would be more entrenched in the United States. And so many African descendants decided not to go to Africa because they didn't want to leave their kinship here. And that's part of this tie back to the family and the need for moral, financial, and familial support. In this context, the rejection of immigration to Africa in the pre-Civil War era was more a response to the needs of an emerging Pan-African community in American bondage than it was a rejection of Africa as a homeland. Indeed, Dr. Martin Delany and Mr. Robert Campbell trekked to Nigeria in 1858, and the settlement treaty they signed with the Alake of Abeokuta confirms that immigration itself was not totally rejected. Now, this is 1858, and these two black men go to Nigeria. They actually negotiate with one of the major kings in Abeokuta, which is where Wole Soyinka is from, to purchase a piece of land, which they did, and sign the treaty with the Alake to resettle African Americans. But the difference is that Delany was a medical doctor, and he was a scientist. And what he said is that we're coming to help build Nigeria. As soon as the British took over, what did they do? What do you think they did? They nullified the treaty. They made it impossible for Africans to go back. And in fact, Campbell went back and started one of the first newspapers in West Africa, in Nigeria. And he stayed there. He remained there and died. There's a street called Campbell Street that's named after Robert Campbell, who was a journalist. And the other man, Martin Delany, who was actually out of Wilberforce, came back to the United States at the time that the Civil War was breaking out and decided to become a major as a medical doctor in the Civil War so that he could help with liberation, because his mother, not his mother, his father, was still enslaved. The idea was to return to Nigeria when they got a chance, and it never happened. Okay, things had changed.